There is a hillside outside Jerusalem where an old olive tree still stands. Its trunk is wide enough that two grown men could not wrap their arms around it. And if you walked up close, if you really looked, you would notice something strange. 9 different branches grow from that one trunk. 9 different kinds of fruit hang from 9 different limbs. Some sweet, some bitter. Some you would never guess belong on the same tree at all. A farmer did this on purpose centuries ago. He took cuttings from 9 different trees and grafted them, one by one, into a single trunk. 9 branches, 1 root. You are looking at a picture of something Paul wrote about almost 2,000 years ago, in a letter to a small group of believers in a Roman province called Galatia. He gave them a list. 9 words: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. And here is the first thing almost everyone gets wrong about that list. This is not a list of rules. This is not a checklist. This is not 9 separate goals you check off one at a time, hoping to master patience this year and move on to gentleness next year. This is one fruit, singular, growing from one root. The Greek word Paul uses is karpos, fruit, not fruits. One fruit with 9 flavors, all drawing from the same source. You cannot grow patience without love feeding it. You cannot have real joy without peace underneath it. They come from the same root, or they do not come at all. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you are going to see exactly what that root is, and what happened to it. Here is what most people miss when they read this list. They read it like a job description. Be more patient. Be more kind. Try harder. And then they fail again on a Tuesday afternoon in traffic or in an argument with someone they love, and they feel like a fraud. But that is not how fruit works. Nobody yells at an apple tree to try harder. An apple tree produces apples because of what is happening underground, in the root, in the soil, in the water it has been drinking for years. So here is the question this video is going to answer. Not, how do I act more loving? Not, how do I fake more patience? But, what does each of these 9 things actually look like in the original language when real people lived it out under real pressure? And then, how do you grow a root like that? You are going to meet a king hiding in a cave with a knife in his hand and a choice that could change a nation. You are going to meet a foreign widow with nothing, choosing loyalty over survival. You are going to meet 2 men singing in a jail cell with their backs torn open. And at the center of it all, you are going to see a man on a cross asking forgiveness for the people killing him. 9 fruits, 1 root. And before this video ends, you are going to find out exactly what happened to that root and why it changes everything about how you grow. Let's start with a cave. Picture cold stone, the smell of bats and damp rock, and a man pressed against the wall in the dark, barely breathing. His name is David. He is young, anointed by a prophet years earlier to be the next king of Israel. But right now, he is a fugitive. The current king, Saul, has an army out hunting him. Saul wants him dead. And then, by what can only be called terrible timing, Saul himself walks into this very cave, alone, to relieve himself. He has no idea David and his men are hiding 20 feet away in the shadows. David's men lean toward him, whispering, "This is it. This is the moment. God has handed your enemy to you. End this. End the running, the hiding, the years of fear. One thrust of a blade and you are king today instead of someday." David creeps forward in the dark, and he does cut something, but not Saul. He cuts a piece of fabric from the corner of Saul's robe, quietly, carefully. And then he lets Saul walk out of that cave alive. This is patience, not the kind where you sit quietly in a waiting room with a magazine. The Greek word that gets translated patience in Galatians is macrothymia, and if you break it down, it literally means long temper. The opposite of a short fuse. It is the ability to hold something for a long time without snapping. David held a knife and a kingdom in his hand, and he held his temper longer than anyone in that cave thought was possible. But here's the part nobody tells you about that story. David did not feel calm afterward. The text says his heart smote him. He was shaken by how close he came, by the weight of what he almost did. Patience is not the absence of struggle. It is the choice made in spite of it. Now, let's leave the cave and go to a road. A widow named Ruth is standing on a dusty road outside Moab with her mother-in-law, Naomi. Naomi has lost everything: her husband, both of her sons, including the one Ruth was married to. Naomi tells Ruth and her sister-in-law to go home, back to their own families, back to whatever future they can still build. There is nothing left for them with her. No money, no land, no protection in a world where a woman without a husband or sons had almost no legal standing at all. Ruth's sister-in-law goes. You can imagine the practical wisdom in that choice: go home, remarry, survive. But Ruth says something that has been quoted at weddings for thousands of years, and most people miss what it actually cost. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Ruth was a Moabite. The Moabites and the Israelites were not friends. She was choosing to walk into a foreign country, with a foreign God, as a foreign widow, with a woman who had nothing to offer her. That is faithfulness, not loyalty when it's convenient, loyalty when it costs you your entire future. And notice, it's also kindness. Ruth didn't have to go. Naomi released her. Ruth chose to stay anyway because Naomi needed someone, and Ruth decided she would be that someone. But it gets stranger, because the story doesn't end with two poor widows scraping by. Ruth ends up the great-grandmother of King David, the very same David who was in that cave. One thread of faithfulness woven generations later into a king. Now, one more story. And this one takes place in a jail. Paul and Silas are missionaries traveling through a Roman city called Philippi. They get arrested, not for a crime, but because they cast a demon out of a slave girl, and her owners were furious about the money they lost. The magistrates have Paul and Silas stripped, beaten with rods until their backs are torn open, and thrown into the innermost cell of the prison, their feet locked in stocks. The historian Josephus, writing about this period of Roman rule, describes prisons that were dark, filthy, overcrowded, places where men were left to rot, sometimes for years, sometimes until they died there. That is the kind of place Paul and Silas are sitting in, at midnight, with open wounds, in chains. And here is what they do. They pray, and then they sing, out loud, hymns. The other prisoners are listening. Picture that for a second. Actual hymns, rising out of a Roman dungeon, from two men whose backs are still bleeding. That is joy. And here is the thing about joy that almost nobody understands. Joy is not happiness. Happiness depends on your circumstances being good. Joy is something else entirely. It survives circumstances. Paul and Silas were not happy. Nothing about their situation was good. But they had joy because joy was never rooted in the jail cell. It was rooted somewhere else. 3 stories: a cave, a road, a jail cell. Self-control and patience, faithfulness and kindness. Joy and peace, even with chains on. 3 completely different situations, and the same thing keeps happening. The fruit doesn't show up when life is easy. It shows up exactly when the pressure is highest. Here's what most people miss about all 3 of those stories. David in the cave wasn't choosing patience because he felt patient. Ruth wasn't choosing loyalty because it felt good. Paul and Silas weren't singing because they felt like singing. In every single case, the fruit showed up at the exact moment when the natural human response would have been the opposite. Anger instead of patience, self-preservation instead of faithfulness, despair instead of joy. And that takes us back to that word from the beginning. Karpos, fruit, singular. Not 9 separate skills you master one at a time like levels in a video game. One fruit. Which means if you are struggling with patience, the answer probably isn't try harder at patience. The answer is to look at the root. Because what's growing, or not growing, above ground always tells you something about what's happening underground. So let's ask the question plainly. If these 9 things are fruit, and fruit grows from a root, what is the root? Hold that thought because we are about to get to the second half of this list, and the stories get heavier. Much heavier. But before we move on, I want you to do something. In the comments, I want you to tell me, using just the number 1 or the number 2, which of these is harder for you. Type 1 if patience is your biggest struggle. Type 2 if faithfulness, staying loyal and steady when no one would blame you for walking away, is your biggest struggle. I'll be reading through those and honestly, I think the answers are going to surprise you. Now, back to the tree. So far we've talked about 3 fruits that grow under pressure: patience, faithfulness, joy, and the peace underneath that joy. But there's a pattern here that goes even deeper than pressure brings out fruit. And to see it, we need to go to the highest stakes story in the entire Bible. Because everything we've looked at so far, a cave, a road, a jail, as real and as costly as those stories are, none of them is the center. They're branches. We haven't gotten to the root yet, and the root is about to get a lot more personal. There is a room on the 2nd floor of a house in Jerusalem. It's evening. 13 men are gathered for a meal, Jesus and his 12 disciples. And in that culture, before a meal like this, a servant would normally wash everyone's feet. Roads were dirt and dust and animal waste. Feet were filthy. It was one of the lowest jobs a person could do. No servant is present, and nobody at that table volunteers. So Jesus gets up. He takes off his outer robe, wraps a towel around his waist, the clothing of a slave, and gets down on the floor. And one by one, he washes the feet of his disciples. Calloused feet, cracked feet, feet that have walked dirt roads for years. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. One of the men whose feet Jesus washes that night is Judas, the same Judas who, within hours, will walk out of that room and sell Jesus to the people who want him dead. Jesus knows this. He knows it while he is washing Judas's feet. There's a Greek word for this kind of gentleness, praiotes. It's the word ancient writers used for a wild horse that had been broken and trained. Not a weak horse, a powerful horse, with all of its strength still intact, but now under control, used for good instead of harm. Praiotes is strength, restrained, and aimed at someone else's benefit. Jesus, on the night before his death, with full knowledge of what Judas is about to do, kneels down and washes his feet anyway. That's not weakness. That's the most controlled, most powerful, most deliberate act of goodness in the entire story. Strength aimed downward, toward the very person about to betray him. This is not weakness pretending to be virtue. This is not passivity dressed up in religious language. This is not someone who simply doesn't have the power to fight back. This is the strongest person in the room, choosing, on purpose, to kneel. Now, watch what happens next. Because the foot washing isn't even the hardest part of this story. The next day, Jesus is nailed to a Roman cross. Above him, soldiers, the same kind of men who whipped him, mocked him, drove the nails, are sitting below, dividing up his clothes. And from the cross, with nails through his hands and feet, Jesus says something. "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." Think about what that sentence requires. In that single moment, love, patience, peace, and gentleness all show up at once in a man who is dying for the people who are killing him. The Greek word for love at the top of Paul's list is agape. It's not the love of a feeling. It's not romance or family affection or the warm glow you get around people you like. Agape is love that acts, regardless of what it gets back. It is love that keeps giving even when the person on the receiving end is doing everything possible to deserve the opposite. Father, forgive them is agape with nails in it. Now we come to the last story, and it's the one that ties everything together. Stephen is one of the first deacons in the early church, a young man known for his faith and his courage. He starts preaching about Jesus in Jerusalem, and the religious leaders drag him in front of a council, accuse him of blasphemy, and the crowd turns into a mob. They take him outside the city walls, and they start throwing stones at him. Not symbolic stones, real ones, large enough to break bone, thrown by a crowd that wants him dead. And while they are killing him, Stephen does two things. He looks up and says he can see heaven open and Jesus standing there. That's peace, the kind Paul described in his letter to the Philippians as a peace that passes understanding. Not peace because the situation is peaceful. Peace in the middle of the exact opposite of peaceful. Stones breaking his body and his eyes fixed somewhere else entirely. And then he says one more thing. Kneeling with stones still coming, Stephen says, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." You have heard that sentence before, or something very close to it. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That was Jesus on the cross the day before. And now, here is Stephen, dying the same way, forgiving the people killing him in almost the exact same words. This is not a coincidence. This is not a nice parallel that a writer added for effect. This is the fruit, growing on a different branch from the same root. And now, finally, we go back to that olive tree. Remember the trunk, 9 branches, grafted from 9 different trees, all sharing one root. We promised we'd come back to that root. Here it is. Centuries before Stephen, before Paul and Silas, before the upper room, the prophets wrote about a coming servant of God who would be pierced for our transgressions, wounded, crushed, and from that wound life would flow out to everyone else. The root was pierced. On a cross, outside Jerusalem, nails through the hands that had washed Judas's feet. And from that pierced root, every branch you have seen tonight draws its life. David's restraint in the cave, Ruth's loyalty on the road, Paul and Silas singing through broken skin, Stephen's forgiveness under a hail of stones. None of it grows on its own. It all traces back to one root, pierced so the branches could live. There's one more thing I want you to picture. Not a cave or a cross or a jail cell, something much smaller. It's 11 at night and a parent is sitting on the edge of a couch, phone in hand, waiting for their teenager to come home. The curfew passed an hour ago. No text, no call. In that small, ordinary moment, every one of these 9 things is being tested at once. Love, that wants the child safe more than it wants to be right. Patience, that has to wait without exploding the second the door opens. Peace, that refuses to assume the worst before there's any reason to. Self-control over the words that come out the moment that kid finally walks through the door. Nobody is throwing stones at that parent. Nobody is locking them in a Roman jail. But the root is exactly the same. The fruit doesn't only grow in history books, it grows on a Tuesday night, on a couch, in your own living room, if the root underneath you is the same root that was pierced 2,000 years ago. So here's what I want you to walk away with tonight. 3 things. First, the truth. These 9 qualities are not 9 separate achievements. They are one fruit with 9 flavors, growing from one root. You cannot manufacture them by trying harder on a Tuesday. You grow them the same way every branch on that olive tree grows fruit, by staying connected to the root. Second, what this means for you. The next time you fail, the next time you snap in traffic, or say something sharp to someone you love, or feel like you have 0 patience left in the tank, that is not proof you're a bad Christian, or a bad person, or that you're failing at some checklist. It's a signal. It's telling you to check the root, not to try harder on the branch. And third, the part I hope you carry with you longest. Every single fruit you saw tonight, David's restraint, Ruth's loyalty, Paul and Silas singing, Jesus on his knees with a towel, Stephen forgiving the people killing him, Every one of them traces back to a root that was pierced, wounded, so that you could be grafted in, so that whatever you're facing this week, the cave, the road, the jail cell, the late-night couch, you are not growing fruit on your own strength. You're drawing from a root that has already been broken open for you. So here's my question for you. Out of everything we covered tonight, David in the cave, Ruth on the road, Paul and Silas in the jail, Jesus with the towel, Stephen under the stones, which one hit you the hardest? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video helped you see something in Scripture you'd never noticed before, do me a favor. Hit like, so more people find this. Subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. And share it with one person you think needs to hear this today. 9 branches, 1 root, and the root was pierced so that you could live.